So I was debating on whether or not I was going to make 2 separate reviews for these games. But then I was like, I can just talk about them in one video. So I would rather give you guys a big review, talking about the series as a whole, than to give you guys 2 separate reviews. Because at the end of the day, my final thoughts are actually pretty simple. Fucking play it. The World Ends With You was one of the most slept on games when it first came out on the Nintendo DS. So when it got remastered on the Nintendo Switch and then it was announced that a sequel was coming out in 2021, I thought that this series would finally get the recognition it deserved. And then the sequel bombed in sales. Well, guess it's up to me, because if I can convince at least one person to give this series a try, then I can at least say I did something good. So even though this is in a review format, this is really just a few minutes of me trying to convince you to play this game. So today, I'm going to be discussing why you should play The World Ends With You and Neo, The World Ends With You. So The World Ends With You came out in 2007, and even for a game that was on the Nintendo DS, this game stood out from every game that came out on the DS at that time. From the gameplay, the design, and that fire-ass soundtrack. And I feel like it took them just recently for them to acknowledge this game again, considering it took them over 10 years for us to get a remaster, an anime, and a sequel. So in this game, you play as Neku, and you wake up with everyone thinking you don't exist. This is just my normal life. And during this time, he ends up fighting monsters, runs into people with black wings, and finds out that he is playing a game known as the Reaper's Game. And if you win the Reaper's Game, then you can have any wish granted. So now Neku's goal is to win the Reaper's Game and to escape this game by any means necessary. Alright, so I'm just gonna say this right now. Yes, this game was made by Square Enix, and yes, Tetsuya Nomura designed these characters. So if you're wondering why Neku looks like an edgy version of Sora, that's why. But anyway, I was actually caught off guard with how invested I ended up being with the story. I know I compared Neku to Sora, but personality-wise, he's almost a polar opposite compared to Sora. Neku starts off as a pretty antisocial loner who thinks it's too much trouble to deal with people. And throughout the game, you see him go from a guy who couldn't give a shit about anyone to a guy who genuinely wants to help people. And as for the rest of the characters, the best way I can describe these characters are Kingdom Hearts characters with drip. Though jokes aside, I legit didn't expect such well-developed characters in this game. I didn't expect them to be bad, I just didn't expect them to be this good. I remember when I first saw Shiki, I thought she was just going to be the generic girl character that ends up having a crush on the main character, like you see in most RPGs basically. But once I got the backstory on why she was in the Reaper's Game to begin with, my entire perspective of the character changed, and the generic girl character I saw in the beginning of the game was nothing more than a facade. And they do that well for a good amount of characters in the game. And for the Reapers, I'm like half and half on them. Now, some of the Reapers are my favorite characters in the game, such as Minamimoto and Karia, and then some of them just feel like one-off villains like Yodai. I just wish that some of the Reapers had gotten a little more development, that's all. Though they do fix this issue in the sequel, so I can't complain. But I think it's time for me to talk about the gameplay, and good lord, I hope I don't piss people off. Now, I loved exploring Shibuya, and the touchscreen input made it so easy to walk around from place to place. However, when it comes to the combat for the DS stylish and touchpad on the Switch, some of the gestures for certain attacks barely ever worked for me. I feel like I have to be as precise as possible with the gesture of the attack or it just won't work. But even when I feel like I've done it precisely, it still doesn't work. It didn't irritate me until later in the game when it got harder, but it pissed me off with certain boss fights. And also, if you docked your Switch and are using the Joy-Cons to play this game, good f***ing luck with that, man. That's the equivalent of playing Dark Souls on Donkey Kong bongos. And somehow even that's easier. That being said, I don't think the gameplay is bad, I just wish it was a little more input friendly. And I won't look like a f***ing idiot while playing this game as I'm drawing circles with my finger, or swiping left and right like an aggressive Tinder user. But that being said, if you're looking for any complaints on the soundtrack and design department, there ain't none. Every DS owner who had this game had to go to the hospital because they suffered severe burns on the palm of their hands from all of the fire that was coming out of that portable device. I haven't heard a soundtrack this unique since Jet Set Radio, and it is definitely one of my biggest highlights of the game. And the design of this game definitely added to that. The 2D comic book style gave so much flair to this game and made it stand out because of it. But with all that said, The World Ends With You gave us a great story, great characters, stylish as f with an amazing soundtrack, but the gameplay wasn't exactly my cup of tea, and it kinda got tedious when I got further in the game. And it is straight up unplayable if you're using the Joy-Cons. Only play handheld if you get this game on the Switch. So with all that said, my final verdict for The World Ends With You is the silver seal of approval.
We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before, but that you're gonna love hearing. Ladies and gentlemen, introducing. We'll be right back after this.
So Neo: The World Ends With You came out in 2021, and this game was fucking slept on. This didn't even get nominated for the Game Awards. Not even for score and music. Okay, so before I jump in with a pissed off rage, let's start off with the story. So in this game, you play as Rindo and his group of friends, Fret, Nagi, and a few others, but I won't spoil anything. And during this time, he meets a lot of different players, he meets Reapers who are controlling the game, and he finds out that in order to get out of the underground, his team has to win the Reapers game. So now Rindo and the gang's goal is to beat every team and get first place by the end of the week in order to win the Reapers game. Alright, so I'm just gonna say this right now. This game is better than the first game. Now I know there are a lot of fans who will live and die for the first game no matter what, but don't let your nostalgia fool you. Because there is one thing in this game that makes it easily superior to the first game. Do you want to know what that is? They made the game playable. I don't care whether it was the DS port or the Switch port, but the touchpad input for certain attacks in the first game was awful. Now, like I said when I was talking about the first game, the gameplay isn't bad. It just became a little tedious as I got further in the game. Was the gameplay unique? 100%, but was it clunky as hell? Absolutely. Neo: The World Ends With You's gameplay is far superior than its predecessor. Not only do all the inputs work for each attack, but it's so simple to use. Each character gets their own separate pin, and all it takes to use their pin is a single press of a button. Using the pins was so much fun to use because of how simple it was. And when you become a master at it, you can chain so many combos together non-stop. And unlike the first game, each character has their own special abilities, such as Nagi's dive, which allows her to go inside people's minds, Fret's remind, which allows him to remind people of things they've forgotten, and Rindo's replay, which basically allows him to go back in time. What I loved the most about these abilities were how each of them were implemented in the story. None of them felt like cheap minigames, and each ability added such a unique element to the game. If anything, the main things that I was worried about when I jumped into this game were the new characters and the story. But thank God I can have a sigh of relief when I say that the characters and the story for this game were fantastic. Rindo is nothing like Neku, but even he has his own flaws that he deals with as you see him grow to become more of a leader throughout the game. And for some reason, I thought I wasn't going to like Fret or Nagi, but I am so glad that I was proven wrong. Each of them had their moments to shine, and by the end of the game, I gave a shit about them way more than I expected to. Though that being said, I feel like Nagi was the only one that didn't really have an arc. I feel like everyone on the team had a very specific moment in the game where they grew, except for Nagi. Now, some might say it was the moment at the end of the game, but everyone had a moment at the end of the game. I'm more talking about the growth leading up to that moment. And that's not to say I didn't like her. I just feel like in comparison to Fret, Rindo, hell, even Shoka, I feel like she kind of grew the least out of the party. But that's just my opinion. But that being said, all of the other characters in this game were also great. Shiba was such a great antagonist, as you slowly witness him go mad with power as the game progresses. Kubo was such a rat bastard, and I still can't believe that Joker from Persona 5 plays him. And Shoka ended up being one of my favorite characters because she had the most development throughout the whole game. In my opinion, the Reapers in this game felt way more of a threat in comparison to the first game. That being said, Minamimoto is still the best Reaper, and I will fight anyone who says otherwise. And I won't spoil anything, but all the returning characters from the last game are not only only great in this game, but some are actually better in this game. You get to see just how the events from the last game affected them and how the events from this game affects them as well. And because of that, I ended up liking some of the older characters that I wasn't even that big of a fan of in the first game. Though I will say this, I thought this series was going to be like the Persona games, where you don't have to play the previous game to play the current one. That is not the case. You 100% need to play The World Ends With You before you play this game. Matter of fact, I was actually confused at one point because there was a character that showed up in this game who was actually in the last game, but I didn't know that because the character shows up in an extra mission at the end of the first game, and you have to do a specific thing to unlock that mission, so I completely missed it. And those of you who have played that mission know exactly who I'm talking about. So yeah, if you think you can jump into this game blind, don't do that, because you are going to be very lost when characters from the previous game show up and you don't know what the hell they're talking about. But I will say, it was so crazy to see the map of Shibuya from the first game be done in 3D in this game. And yes, I know this isn't the first time we've seen Shibuya in a game, but seeing this map from a 2D perspective from the first game be done in 3D was crazy to see for the first time. I legit love walking around the map, buying clothes, buying albums, and eating food. I am so glad they didn't get rid of that from the first game. It is literally one of my favorite things to do in the game. And the one thing that they added in this game that wasn't in the first game was the social network feature. Each connection you unlock gives you a different item or ability, and the way you unlock more connections is by either progressing further into the main story or by doing a character's side mission. I love this mechanic, and it also gives you a reason to do the side missions. But enough of all of that, I want to talk about the design of this game for a moment. When people think of stylish games, Persona 5 is like one of the first ones that comes up, and that's understandable. But I feel like Neo deserves some love too, because Persona 5 might be stylish, but it does not have the drip like Neo The World Ends With You. The style in this game is so underrated, and it makes me shocked that not many people have played this game just by looks alone, because the moment I saw this game, I knew I was gonna play it, simply just for the style alone. And for those of you who are worried that the soundtrack wasn't going to be on par with the first game, you can put those worries aside, because the soundtrack still freaking slaps. The soundtrack slaps so hard that it just made me want to slap someone's grandma. The remixes to the old tracks and the brand new tracks in this game are absolutely incredible. And as much as I love the opening twister from the first game, I'm sorry, but The World Is Yours blows it by a fucking mile. So not only are some tracks just as good as the first game, but some even surpass them. The best way to describe Neo The World Ends With You is like this. This is the Jet Set Radio Future of sequels. And for those of you who have played Jet Set Radio Future, I want to fucking kiss you right now. This game is superior in every way to its predecessor, but for some reason it is not getting the same amount of love like its predecessor, even though it should be getting more love than its predecessor. And there are a few things to blame for why that's the case. First of all, the marketing was shit for this game, and they did a terrible job when it came to promoting this game for new fans. I know you do need knowledge of the first game to play this game, but you barely promoted the first game when it came out on the Switch! I understand that it's an old game, but when you know there's a sequel coming out, then you should hype up this game like Christmas. Basically, the main thing you should get out of this video is play The World Ends With You. You can easily buy it on the Switch, and as I said earlier, I recommend you play it handheld because the cursors are a bitch. I would recommend the DS version, but the final remix has a lot of extra content that you'll miss out on if you don't get it on the Switch. And once you've done that, obviously, buy Neo The World Ends With You. This isn't an argument. Once you buy the first game, you're buying the second game. You can get the game on the Switch as well, but if you want, you can also get it on the PS4 and PC. But with all that said, Neo The World Ends With You gave me some great characters, great story, fun gameplay, an amazing soundtrack, and an underrated style. So with all that said, my final verdict for Neo The World Ends With You is the golden seal of approval.